I'm Marcia Castro. I'm a demographer here at the Harvard School of Public Health, and my role in this session is to really try to show you why space is special. And more specifically, we're going to be discussing the role of social and environmental place in many different studies, with a special focus on health-related studies. The way we're going to do this is to divide the session into 3 different modules, and each one will run for about 20 minutes. And in the first module, we're going to talk about very specific concepts that we should get cleared out right in the beginning. And I'll give you a few examples of very detailed frameworks that try to bring together both the individual and the environment together in one single model. And the goal is to show why those studies and those frameworks are really important and what lessons we can take from them. On the second module, we're going to really focus on geospatial techniques and see what kind of difference they made in the way they were used. And again, I'm going to try to focus a little bit more on public health examples. The last module, then we're going to talk about challenges that we always face in trying to do those studies, but I'll give you a few hints on how we can overcome those challenges. And then I'll talk a little bit about the software that is available for running those different models. So I wanted to start by really going over the teaching goals that we're going to have. So first of all, I really want to make clear what's the importance of space. Then I want to show you the different types of spatial effects that we have and how can we measure space in the studies. And then we're going to conclude with a few examples of frameworks and studies that brought together in the same model the environmental and the social. So I wanted to start by showing this quote. This is a paper from 2000, and it seems a little bit old. It's 13 years old, but to me it's still a masterpiece. And the reason is it really makes clear why bringing together the social and the spatial in one single framework is important, not only to build knowledge, but to translate this knowledge into policy making. And above all, to make this policy targeted. And when we talk about targeting the policy, we talk about targeting to groups, but also targeting those groups spatially. So when we talk about space, that's really not a novel thing. We can go as back as the writings from Hippocrates, which highlighted the role of space in understanding disease transmission. And you can see that right in the title of one of his books, place gets a very special attention. What is important in here is that when we think about individuals and we think about places, we have to keep in mind that individuals are transformed, but also transform the places. So you have this two-way relationship that although where you live may impact your health outcomes, the way you interact with the location where you live also has an impact. And the goal here is to understand the processes that play a role in this interaction. If we do understand the processes, we can make better judgments about patterns of disease transmission. We can understand better how we can implement a surveillance system, but above all, we can do a much better job in implementing policies that are more effective and more cost-effective in improving the health of the population. Now, let me make it clear what we mean by the social and what we mean by the environment. The environment is not just the natural environment, so the climate, the vegetation, the elevation. It's also the human-made environment. So it's what results from this interaction with the individuals. So it's the patterns of urbanization that can have impacts, for example, on pollution and respiratory diseases. It's how people use the land. It's how deforestation can take place. The key issue here is that when we talk about the environment, we're talking about something that really plays a role in different scales. So it goes all the way from the village to the national level, and all of those need to be accounted for. When we talk about the social, we have the usual suspects. We have the characteristics of individuals, their perceptions, and their behavior. Now, what are the types of spatial effects? So when we say that a certain data has spatial effects, a certain phenomena has spatial effects, what do we mean by that? We have two different types of spatial effects. The first one is spatial heterogeneity. And that basically deals with the overall average of the phenomena that we're looking at in a particular area. So for example, consider Earth and consider the different biomes that we have on Earth. So you have a patch with tropical forest, then you have another one with desert, then you have another one with savanna, then you have the temperate forest. So these are patches of biome that are located across Earth. That describes heterogeneity. So basically, if you take an average of this one parameter that is biomes on Earth, the average is not the same. The same happens with, for example, population. So if the population is not evenly distributed across a certain locality, you can have heterogeneity in the distribution. So that's one type of effect. The type of spatial effect we tend to focus much more is spatial dependence. Now here we are not talking about averages, but we're talking about correlation. The goal in here is to see to what extent what you observe in one area depends on what happens in surrounding areas. So the whole idea of dependence, of correlation in space, is the motivation for what we call the first law of geography, which says that everything is related to everything else, but closer things are more related than distant things. Now, this is very similar to time series analysis when you expect that things that happen close in time are going to be much more similar than things that happen very far apart in time. It's the same idea, but we're shifting from a temporal perspective to a spatial perspective. Now, we can check if the data has spatial dependence by asking one simple question. Do we have dependence in the data? Is the data correlated? Do you have, for example, a clustering pattern? The answer is yes or no. So that's what we call a global test. But we can do a much better job by asking the question if you do have some clustering, but asking where are the clusters. That's when we do a local test. So not only we answer the question if dependence is present, but we can point out in the map where it happens. Now, if those are the two types of spatial effects, then the question now is, how do we measure space? How do we try to assess if those effects are happening or not in our data? Well, if you look at usual studies, the way space would be accounted for was just to introduce a variable that would have some geographical character. So for example, you say, well, this area is urban or rural. You have a category to describe districts. But that's not really account for a spatial effects, because those units are defined a priori without no knowledge of how people are interacting in a space. So the way we're going to measure space is to define what we call a neighborhood structure. So the neighborhood structure is this one area where you would expect that things would be similar. So again, go back to the first law of geography, near things are similar. How do you define near? And the near is defined by this neighborhood structure. There are many different ways you can build up this neighborhood. The very simple one is just to say that a neighbor is anybody that shares a boundary with another location. So if you look in the slide in this hypothetical area, you have 5 regions in here. The way we define a neighborhood is to, for example, take region A and see which regions share a boundary with A, and in this case, it's just B and D. So if you build up a matrix defining the neighborhood structure, you can see here region A gets a 1 for B and D, because those are the ones that they share a boundary with. So those would be the neighbors. Now, when we think about sharing boundaries, there are different ways to do this neighborhood structure. And they're all inspired by a chessboard. So the first one is what we call the Rook's case. So you're basically going north, south, east, and west. The second one, it's the Bishop's case, and now you're looking at neighbors in the diagonal. And the one that we use the most, which makes more sense for most of the studies, is to use what we call a Queens neighborhood. So basically you take all the locations sharing any boundaries with the one location you're using as a reference. Now, there are other ways to define neighborhoods, and instead of being sharing a boundary, you can consider distance. So how we're going to do in this example is you're going to draw central points in each one of those regions, and then you draw a buffer. There is a certain distance from the center point. And then all the neighbors are going to be the locations that had their centroids inside this buffer zone. So in this case, again, if you take this region B, the neighbors are going to be only A and C, despite the fact that B is sharing boundaries with other locations. Now, why would it make sense to have a neighborhood based on distance? Well, think about a mosquito-borne disease that you're studying, where the flight range of the mosquito is the key variable in trying to search for a particular pattern. That would be a clear example when distance would be much more important than just sharing a boundary. There are yet other ways of defining the neighborhood, which are to some extent a little bit more elaborate and more creative. So you can have what we call demographic neighborhoods, you can have economic distances, and here is one example where the neighborhood structure is based on the difference in employment rates between locations. So again, it all depends on what is your study, what is your research question, and what kind of data you have. Now, choosing a neighborhood structure based on adjacency, based on distance, based on any other criteria, really has to rely on what you know about the phenomena you want to study. It has to rely on your question, the question you want to answer, but also there are two rules of thumb. Usually, the simpler the better, the closer the better. Okay, so what I wanted to do now is to go over 3 examples that did a terrific job in bringing together the social and the environment in a very complex framework that tries to capture relationships explaining the outcome at different levels of scale. So the goal here is to really try to catch our attention to the importance of accounting for space, but above all, accounting for those processes that happen between individuals and space transforming each other. So the first one is looking at physical activity and all the impacts that that can have on health. What you see in this framework on the right side of the slide is basically layers of variables that would be important in trying to explain levels of physical activity. Now you can see that the environment here comes in many different scales, and it comes in many different ways. So you have the natural environment that we saw before. You have the built environment, which is a result of the interactions between the environment and the individual. So you have land use patterns. That's a result of how people are using the environment for whatever purposes they have. We also have the social environment, the individual characteristics. So what is the idea here? First of all, you can see that you have the social and environment, but they're acting at different levels of scale, and all of them should be accounted for. The second thing is you can notice that in the individual determinants, you have the beliefs, which is really related to behavior, which really opens the opportunity for having both quantitative and qualitative studies. So not only you have multiple scales, multiple factors, you can use different types of data to be able to explain this particular phenomena that here is physical activity. The other thing is there's a whole literature on looking at life course events. So you basically try to understand what individuals went through their lives and how that can impact patterns of morbidity and mortality in adult life. When we look at this framework, there is something else in here that we need to pay attention, is that we can also look at life course events spatially. In other words, it probably matters where individuals lived over their life in terms of the outcomes that they observe in adult ages. And I know of at least one example. It's a large study in the US that is looking at kidney cancer that is trying to trace back where and for how long individuals lived in different places and to what extent that can impact the incidence of kidney cancer. A clear example of the result of this framework is to study obesity among immigrants in the US and how they change once they move to the US. So basically you have this change in place that leads to change in all those different levels of scale that appear in this framework. The next one is drawn from my own work. So this is a framework that is looking at malaria transmission in one particular setting, the Amazon region. And the idea here is, if you think of the key definition of malaria, you have basically three actors. You have the humans, you have the parasite, you have the vector. They are interacting with each other, transforming each other in some cases. But all of this is really happening in a certain environment, both the natural and the human-made. And the key thing is, when you look at those arrows here, you can see the environment is impacting humans, but the humans are transforming the environment. So again, that thing that I highlighted in the beginning, that individuals are interacting but are also changing the environment. Now, the key issue in this particular framework is, if we look at how malaria transmission in those areas in the Amazon region take place, it's a whole different concept. It's called frontier malaria. So here, the multiple scales are also present. And what I'm showing here is sort of a sample of some of the variables in three different scales: individual, community, and national. We also have a temporal scale, and we have multiple factors that are acting at the same time. So in this case, what we need is a model that is able to account for all those interactions between individuals and space at different scales, and then get this knowledge that we produce from this model translated into policies. And in this case, the policies really have to be targeted not only to certain groups, for example, children under 5, farmers, miners, but also target in space, where those groups are in that particular locality. The third example I want to show deals with vulnerability. So now there is a whole effort in trying to assess vulnerability to many things. So this particular example is vulnerability to natural disasters, but there is a whole literature now in trying to assess social vulnerability to different disease patterns, for example. Now, in this particular framework, what is really key and what I really want to call your attention to is the fact that we have the individual conditions, we have the environmental conditions, we have this nice arrow right here in the middle showing that it is a two-way relationship. So individuals are influencing, but are also influenced by the environment. And you have all the different scales that are acting in here. So again, from a spatial perspective, you have three different scales, but you also have temporal scales that are playing a role in this particular framework. So again, the goal in here is bring together all these different variables at all those different scales to be able to explain one particular outcome, which is the vulnerability. Now, why would that be important? Well, the key issue is, if you take a vulnerability study, you can have individuals that look exactly the same context from a social perspective, and they have completely different outcomes in terms of vulnerability. You can also take individuals that are living in environments that are completely the same environmental context, and their vulnerability is the same. Why is that? What you have is this interaction between the social layer of vulnerability, the environmental layer of vulnerability, and what we need to understand are the processes that are making some social factors overcome the environmental factors and vice versa, in a way that combinations of conditions can either maximize or reduce the levels of vulnerability. Why do we care about this? The reason is there's this huge effort in coming up with adaptation strategies, in this case to natural disasters, and we can only come up with adaptation strategies if we do understand those processes that result in some conditions maximizing or reduce the vulnerability. Now, the question that remains are basically how do you actually can gather data and link data to be able to do those kind of studies. The second thing is, once you have the data, how do you identify patterns? How do you know those patterns are real and not just a result of what your eyes are seeing? And the third one is, how can you account for space if you're really trying to do explanatory models? And we're going to discuss those three issues in the next module.